when you have government slowing down the ability of the private sector to adapt and respond. In a normal situation, that's a cost. In a pandemic, it's a life or death issue. And unfortunately, I suspect that thousands and thousands of lives were lost because government slowed down the private sector's ability to quickly not only deal with vaccines, but with treatments, with personal protective equipment, all sorts of issues like that.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the show. I've got a great guest with us here today, Dan Mitchell, who's an economist and chairman for the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Dan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Glad to be with you, Brad.
So, listeners, there'll be a link in the show notes, but I'm a regular reader of Dan's blog where he writes about economics and what's going on in the news, and he did a 5-part series about the coronavirus pandemic and how it really has related to a series of failures by big government and by concentrated state power. And that very much piques my interest, and I know a lot of you, my listeners, are too, but let's just start at the beginning, Dan. If we go all the way back to when the first COVID cases started to crop up, one of the big issues we had was testing. We didn't have enough tests, we couldn't stop the pandemic early on, we couldn't do tracing to shut it down like some other countries did. What does that have to do with the government?
Unfortunately, we have a couple of bureaucracies, the Centers for Disease Control and the Food and Drug Administration, and these bureaucracies have an enormous amount of power in terms of approving medical devices, medical products, medical services. Of course, Food and Drug Administration goes to all sorts of consumer products and services. If you ever want to take a horrible risk of drinking unpasteurized milk, you might have to worry about the FDA police knocking on your door. But in terms of the pandemic, when all of a sudden this new problem hit not just the United States, but the entire world, but at least in the United States, the ability of the private sector to ramp up production of all sorts of things. I mean, not just testing services, but remember when hand sanitizers had a huge shortage? Well, that's because you can't simply retool a factory and to produce more of it because you have to go through what is normally a very slow and bureaucratic process of getting approval from these various departments and agencies. And by the way, we're not even talking about whether or not there are different state government rules that might slow you down as well. Now, I want to be fair. In a normal world where you're not dealing with a crisis, as a libertarian, I might not like these rules and all this bureaucracy and the lengthy approval process, but I guess I'll be the first to admit it's probably not a life or death decision if it takes you 3 months instead of 1 week to get approval from a bureaucracy to build a new factory for producing some sort of medical device. But when we're dealing with a pandemic that had very deadly impact, especially for vulnerable populations like the elderly, this kind of red tape was just utterly nonsensical, and it no doubt contributed to the high death rate that we faced.
Specifically in regard to testing, what did they do exactly to block private sectors? They forced them to use a government test or what?
Well, it's not that they set out, of course. I want to be fair to the bureaucrats. They didn't set out and say, well, let's go ahead and use our power to squeeze these companies and somehow extort some sort of favors. They just had an already in place procedure that, again, as we just talked about, normally isn't very fast paced. And all of a sudden, when there was this massive overnight crisis of, oh my goodness, we need more hand sanitizer, we need more N95 masks, we need more testing services. And by the way, they eventually did accelerate under pressure doing a lot of these things. And many of our friends in the economics community even created a hashtag called hashtag never need it to make the point that a lot of these regulations that were slowing things down, why did we have them in the first place? But again, normally it didn't really matter. If you wanted to go out as an entrepreneur and start building wheelchairs or something like that, the fact that it might take you 3 months for some FDA bureaucrat to stamp a piece of paper, it's probably not going to be a major issue because it's probably going to take you several months to have the architecture for the factory and things like that. And by the way, even still, even with the fact that we did finally force these bureaucracies to move quicker, there are many things that they drag their feet on forever, such as should consumers have the freedom to simply order a test online and conduct the test themselves. There's just this natural instinctive reluctance on the part of bureaucracies to trust people making their own decisions. That's why they don't want whether it's taking some multivitamin or some experimental treatment for coronavirus. They want to be the ones sort of playing the role of mother and father, and we're just the helpless little children who need to be guided. And again, if you assume that bureaucrats are not omnipotent and omniscient, and if you assume that sometimes there are genuine crises where you can't follow some standard operating procedure that takes months and months and months, this is why this whole never needed approach that some people have been making the argument for. I would like to think that we're not going to get rid of the regulations. Let's deal with that unfortunate reality. But let's at least hope that a lesson has been learned so that if another pandemic or some other healthcare emergency happens, we can vastly accelerate the process compared to what we dealt with over the last 15 months or so, because we knew some of the basic details for making the vaccine in a remarkably short period of time. This whole technology, which of course I don't understand in the slightest, but the way they developed the vaccine, they actually had the underlying genetic understanding of what needed to happen, but it still took months and months and months and months before the various bureaucracies finally allowed these things to be rolled out. Now, there's a reason for that. They'll tell you, well, we don't want some vaccine that could have accidental side effects that can kill you. But here's where they're playing mother and father again. If I'm 62, almost 63. What if I was 20 years older? And what if I had underlying health conditions? So if I got coronavirus, high likelihood I would die. Shouldn't I have the freedom to take an experimental vaccine? I'll sign whatever waivers I need to sign, but government bureaucracies don't want to let people have the freedom to make those choices.
Now, why is that? Can you talk about the incentives that bureaucrats face that make them so risk averse to help people understand where that comes from?
Well, in the case of the Food and Drug Administration, this is way before your time, but the whole thalidomide scandal, where there was some product that actually did cause some serious birth defects. I think it was an antidepressant, but I'm not even sure about the underlying original purpose for thalidomide. But I think it was the FDA or whatever it was called back then said no, but in the United Kingdom and some other countries, I believe they said yes. And so the bureaucrats at the FDA, or again, whatever it was called back then, maybe it was the FDA, they looked upon that story as their holy grail. Look at this. We saved lives, or maybe not lives, but we avoided birth defects because we said no, we were hyper cautious. So, and that's real. That was a real achievement on their part. However, there's a flip side of that story in statistics and social scientists. They have this thing called type 1 errors, type 2 errors. Well, the FDA is only focusing on one side of the story. If we're super cautious, if we require very expensive testing, if we require a long time for testing, we can minimize a certain type of mistake, which is the fact that you might have bad side effects from a certain medication. But what this also means, though, is that they're increasing another type of error, which is the fact that medicines that save lives or at least improve lives are sometimes deployed in America years after they're available elsewhere. So if you have a medicine, and there are different ways that public health people and statisticians measure this, quality, life years, and all these other things. But the point is that you can have people in America that are dying today because there's some treatment that may have been approved in other countries, but because the FDA is so cautious, we don't have access to that medication. But you asked about the incentives for the bureaucrats. Well, if you're an FDA bureaucrat and you approve a medicine that it turns out has negative side effects, you probably get fired. You probably get condemned in a congressional hearing. People will be writing scholarly articles about the mistake that you made. But if you're a bureaucrat who simply delays a good medicine from getting on the shelves or getting in the pharmacies, that's just considered the normal cost of doing business. So no one's going to drag you in front of a congressional hearing. No one's going to sue you. No one's going to fire you. You're just a bureaucrat doing your job. And so the incentives for FDA bureaucrats and other bureaucrats in our sprawling federal government is to be super cautious, even though the academic research shows that the FDA causes on net lost lives. It doesn't save lives on net because the one type of error of delaying valuable medications and treatments that overwhelmingly dominates the fact that, okay, maybe we avoid some negative side effects with an occasional medicine or treatment here and there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to all of this, but I do wonder about this because Libertarian presidential candidate Joe Jorgensen took a pretty bold stance, and I'm not saying this is your view, right? But she said, abolish the CDC, abolish the FDA, get rid of them entirely. Isn't there some role for the government in preventing, people would have been out there selling fake cures for COVID, fake vaccines, right? For stopping fraud, dangerous products. I mean, don't we have to have some type of regulatory apparatus in order to keep people safe from that kind of thing?
Well, way before there was ever an FDA or a CDC, there were laws against fraud. And you can very easily envision the absence of an FDA and CDC in today's world and still have plenty of laws against fraud. So if someone's selling some nonsensical fake treatment, by all means, bust them, throw them in jail, strip them of their assets. If you're trying to rip off people, I mean, whether you're going door to door and selling some fake driveway resealing, or whether you're trying to hawk some fake vaccine or fake hand sanitizer, that's already against the law. I mean, it sort of reminds me of the whole gun control argument. Oh, well, someone committed murder with a gun. Let's make the gun illegal. Well, murder's already illegal. So what exactly are you achieving? I don't know that adding a new bureaucracy with a new set of powers to go after the same thing that's already illegal, I don't know that that actually solves any problem.
Right. That makes sense to me. But do we have to give these bureaucrats some credit? You mentioned the vaccine briefly earlier. Vaccines like this previously have taken, 5 years, 10 years, 8 years. But because of Operation Warp Speed, they got a lot of the red tape and they got this vaccine approved in a year, which is still a long time, but it's record time, way faster than normal. Do we have to give them some credit for that?
Well, I give them some credit for responding to the pressure, and I start with the assumption that people who work at the FDA and CDC are good people who actually want to advance public health. I don't think they're bad people scheming there, let's deny people life-saving treatments. But they do respond to political incentives and political pressure. And as we already talked about, there is this incentive to be super cautious. And they did relax that super cautious posture because of the enormity of the coronavirus pandemic. And I'm not a public health expert, but I read someplace that there are like normally three steps that have to happen in sequence, one after the other. And they allowed them to happen at the same time, which did speed up enormously how quickly we got the vaccines. And there's also no question that the vaccines that were developed as part of Operation Warp Speed, they obviously seem to work better than the Chinese and Russian versions, and even the AstraZeneca version, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's very, very good, but it appears that the Pfizer and some of the other vaccines in the United States are even better. Is that just because of the quality of U.S. companies? Maybe the FDA and CDC, because of all their rules, enabled us to somehow get better vaccines. I'm not going to deny that there are sometimes benefits to things that happen in the public health bureaucracies. All I'm saying is we have to measure those benefits against the costs that are incurred because of those bureaucracies. And in many cases, I wind up thinking that the costs are a lot higher than the benefits. And obviously, it's the net that we should be considering.
Well, and when you think about even stepping back from the United States specifically, but whether it's the Communist Chinese Party or the Chinese Communist Party or the World Health Organization, it seems to me, I mean, these organizations were downplaying COVID, saying that it didn't actually spread to humans. Then they were saying don't wear masks, then do. Even on that level, have we seen governmental and quasi governmental bodies like that wield concentrated power really botch their credibility and mishandle this pandemic in a way that could have been avoided?
There's no question that that I think people have lost faith. Of course, a lot of them didn't have faith in the first place, but I think that you have more skepticism. As a matter of fact, I think the vaccine skepticism that's out there now is in part a function of the fact that people simply don't trust government officials anymore. And the way I describe it is I agree. You should not trust government officials, but that doesn't mean that everything they say is wrong. So I got a vaccine the moment I had the opportunity to get it. Doesn't
As
mean I
well.
want to force everyone to do it, but I think that they should do it unless there's some really powerful reason why it shouldn't happen. But yes, I obviously don't have any trust in the government in Beijing to tell the truth about what happened. The WHO, like all international bureaucracies, just about, I think, is just a self-serving entity filled with bureaucrats getting tax-free jobs, and they want to keep those sinecures going, and they always take the path of least resistance to keep their nice cushy lifestyle going. So I don't trust the WHO. I don't trust the government in Beijing, and I don't have total trust by any means, even in the United States government. We've seen with the release of Fauci's emails that he was playing a political game. Now, you could argue, I think, quite legitimately, that some of his political game was being done for at least a semi-noble reason. Well, let's tell people they don't need masks because we want to make sure that our limited supply at the time was available for healthcare workers. Now, should he have lied about that? I don't think so, but at least he was lying for a semi-defensible reason. But then, all the guidance from the CDC about, maybe even still today, kids going to summer camp wearing masks outside. I mean, that's absurd. I think I read, knock on wood, that they actually backed down away from that. But again, it's hyper cautious bureaucrats responding to the incentives that those of us who understand public choice economics, which is simply the incentives of politicians and bureaucrats, I mean, they don't behave in a competent, effective manner because when you're in government, you don't have to consider costs and benefits of your actions. You just consider the political implications.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I started out giving Fauci the benefit of the doubt. I've really lost any credibility in my eyes. Even Rochelle Walensky, the Biden administration's new CDC director, a couple months ago, she was out there talking about, I'm so scared. We're going to have impending doom. Things have literally only gotten better since then. Case counts are down. Way more people are vaccinated. And at the time, there was no reason to have this alarmist. So those incentives, they really manifested themselves. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about I think honestly the biggest piece of big government destruction in this pandemic is these sweeping, harsh lockdowns that we saw across the country, across the globe, in different levels, in different places. But basically, they made people's livelihoods illegal. They criminalized socialization. They shut down schools. They took these unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, sweeping acts of government power. How do you evaluate them in retrospect?
Well, I think there are two things that come to my mind. First, the general public was already going into lockdown mode anyhow. If you look at the data, pre-lockdowns and post-lockdowns, you see that there was a trend line where people were already avoiding public places, already reducing the socialization that they were doing and things like that. So the lockdowns may have simply been bureaucrats getting in front of a parade that was already happening anyhow. Now, as a libertarian, I don't want the government to order people into lockdown. It might very well be that I'll decide I don't want to go to public places myself, but I think I should have the freedom to make a cost benefit decision on my own. Now, by and large, even before the lockdowns were ordered, I was still being cautious. And I don't think that the lockdowns changed anything. So that's one part. Give people the benefit of the doubt. We can make rational choices ourselves, and we're certainly as capable of making as rational choices as politicians and bureaucrats are making. But the thing that really bothered me, that for some reason always galled me about the lockdowns, is the politicians would close certain stores but leave other stores open. Well, if I go to a local Walmart or Target, I can buy jewelry, but the politicians close the jewelry stores. I can go to a mall and I can buy clothing, but the politicians closed the clothing stores, but I can still buy the clothing at Walmart or Target. And so, what was the rationale for letting big box stores stay open, but then closing all these small businesses? Certainly you could have had the same social distancing policies in small establishments as you had in big box stores. So I think so much. I mean, what was the most bizarre case of all in Michigan, where the crazy governor there opened certain box stores, but then required that certain parts of those box stores be fenced off. I mean, who actually comes up with these policies and in the cold light of day thinks, oh, this makes sense. If I walk down this aisle, I'll somehow get coronavirus, but if I walk down the adjoining aisle, I'll be okay. But that's what you get with politicians and bureaucrats having a lot of control and power.
Yeah, look, to play devil's advocate for a second, I completely agree with everything you're saying. I think people can make much better decisions for themselves than the government can make for them. But I think people who disagree with us would say that in a pandemic, there's an externality. So your behavior imposes costs on others, for listeners, right? And therefore, your own cost benefit analysis of whether or not, say, look at me, I'm 23, no health issues. My cost benefit analysis says for COVID, keep doing everything. But if I go out about and live my life, I could have infected somebody who is at serious risk, and that's a cost that wouldn't be in my own decision making. So big government people would argue that because of those externalities, we've got to have the government step in and overrule people's decision making. How do you respond?
Well, I don't want to say that's an illegitimate argument because, yes, there are externalities, and especially early in the process, we didn't really know or have much confidence in what we were being told about. Well, how deadly is the disease? How easily does it spread? There were all these debates about is it a contact thing? Is it an aerosol thing? But I think when we have this discussion, this is where I come down on the issue of vaccine passports and things like that. I think private businesses should have the right to determine whatever rules they want. So if my local Walmart or Target or grocery store said you still have to wear a mask regardless of whether you're vaccinated, that's their freedom. And or let's take an issue that's in the news. Down in Florida, the cruise ships want to require vaccinations to go on cruises. Well, the governor DeSantis, who I think normally is a pretty sensible guy, he said, no, I'm going to make it illegal to require vaccines on the part of private businesses. Well, I don't think that's his job. It's the private business should have the freedom to make the cost benefit choices. Will we get more customers? Will we get more business if they feel confident that we're requiring vaccinations? On the other hand, maybe a different cruise ship company will say, no, we don't want to drive away customers by requiring all this paperwork and stuff like that. Politicians should stay out of that kind of decision. Let sort of a decentralized marketplace filter these decisions, and I think you'll actually wind up with a better, so-called equilibrium of public health and private commerce.
Well, and that kind of reminds me of something that I read in part of your series that cracked me up a little, then depressed me the more I thought about it. Basically, all these agencies that have made mistakes, the CDC, the FDA, Dr. Fauci, they in a private business, right? If you are a bad entrepreneur, you mismanage your business, it will go under. But a lot of these agencies will probably end up getting bigger budgets and expanded departments and more programs after all of this, right? No matter how bad they mess things up.
Oh, there's no question. I haven't actually crunched those numbers, which I should, since I'm a public finance economist first and foremost. But I can say with 99.9% certainty that if we look at, say, the 2023 budget for the FDA and the CDC, I wouldn't be surprised if it'll be twice as big as, say, the 2018 budget for those agencies. Now, in part, that's just because Trump was spending money. Now Biden's spending money. Politicians love to spend money. But you're exactly right in the thrust of your question, which is that in the private sector, failure gets punished. In the public sector, failure gets rewarded. I mean, who was it? Was it, I forget whether Walter Williams or Milton Friedman, but one of the great economists of recent decades had some famous line about that tendency of failure to be rewarded, and how no government agency ever wants or has an incentive to solve the problem for which it was created.
Yeah, I think Milton in one of his books, or maybe this is Soul, but he talks about a cancer charity that's founded, right? If cancer was cured, they would become a charity for survivors of cancer, or they would find a way to adapt their mission so they could continue to exist because they have salaries and they have networks and they have careers they've built out relying on it. The government's essentially the same thing in a much, much bigger scale, isn't it?
Well, and also the fact that when push comes to shove, they don't have to ask for our money; they just come and take it.
Even more so then. So I guess if you could look at the pandemic as we've all experienced it and tell people one economic takeaway that they should draw from it all, what would it be?
That when push comes to shove and there's a genuine crisis, we don't want government gumming up the works and slowing down the ability of the private sector to react. I mean, is the private sector capable of making mistakes when operating quickly in a crisis? Of course, it's capable of making mistakes. But I think that you deal with those mistakes through the tort system and through ordinary uniform commercial code provisions. You don't have to reinvent the wheel to deal with either fraud or mistakes. But when you have government slowing down the ability of the private sector to adapt and respond, in a normal situation, that's a cost. In a pandemic, it's a life or death issue. And unfortunately, I suspect that thousands and thousands of lives were lost because government slowed down the private sector's ability to quickly not only deal with vaccines, but with treatments, with personal protective equipment, all sorts of issues like that. And as we talked about earlier in the program, the folks that popularized that never needed hashtag, I hope that we haven't forgotten that lesson. Now, I'm not expecting the Biden administration to have any sympathy for the notion that we need a more flexible, streamlined, bureaucratic process for treatments and devices. But I do hope that the FDA and CDC learn from this process that when something big is going on, that they need to, in effect, the slight liberalization that they allowed in response to the crisis, hopefully they can, in effect, make that a permanent part of the process now, so that the next time we deal with this situation, we can, instead of having to wait 6 months or 8 months, maybe it'll only take 2 or 3 months.
Here's hoping that's the case. I don't know that I'd place any significant bets on it, but certainly we all hope so. So, Dan, we round out the show every episode with a food take. I know you know this, and you've had a chance to think about it a little bit. What is your most controversial food opinion?
My most controversial food opinion is that I have the taste buds of a 10-year-old. I would much rather have some Kraft macaroni and cheese than go to some Michelin starred restaurant, and I'd much rather have a chocolate milkshake than a $200 bottle of wine. A lot of my friends look at me with horror when I state those opinions, but that's who I am.
I have some sympathy for that for sure, but maybe some people will find that controversial. I get more hate for eating the steak well done with ketchup, just like Trump. So
Oh, okay. Now, medium rare is the only way to have a steak. So yeah, no, you're borderline communist for that.
yeah, well, thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thank you, Brad.